They laughed at the man pushing a rusty wheelbarrow, never imagining that the richest woman in the city would one day risk everything just to stand beside him. Every morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached downtown Atlanta, Marcus Reed was already walking the streets with both hands gripping the worn wooden handles of an old wheelbarrow. Its faded paint had long disappeared beneath layers of scratches, and one wheel made a soft, squeaking sound every few feet, but it was the only thing Marcus owned that allowed him to earn an honest living. He carried boxes for small grocery stores, hauled discarded furniture away from apartment buildings, and delivered heavy supplies for anyone willing to pay a few dollars. Most people never looked him in the eye. To them, he was simply another homeless man blending into the sidewalks, another face they hurried past without a second thought. When business owners needed cheap labor, they waved him over. When the work was finished, they often dropped a few wrinkled bills into his hand without learning his name. Marcus accepted every job with the same quiet gratitude, because every dollar meant another meal, another pair of clean socks from the thrift store, or another night spent with a full stomach instead of an empty one. As the city came alive, expensive cars rolled past him, while professionals hurried into gleaming office towers, carrying coffee cups that cost more than his breakfast. He never envied them. Instead, he smiled whenever an elderly shopper needed help loading groceries, or a struggling vendor needed someone to move heavy crates. If they could not afford to pay him, Marcus simply nodded and helped anyway. Kindness had become the one thing poverty could never take from him. Across the street stood the magnificent Sterling Grand Hotel, its polished glass reflecting the morning sky like a monument to success. Luxury SUVs lined the entrance as sharply dressed guests stepped onto the red carpet beneath the hotel's elegant canopy. Marcus slowed his wheelbarrow, hoping to cross before the traffic grew heavier. Before he reached the driveway, a hotel security guard stepped forward and firmly motioned him away. "Not here," the guard said, with a polite but unmistakably dismissive tone. "Please use the service alley around the block." Marcus quietly apologized, turned his wheelbarrow, and walked away without argument, even though the detour would add nearly half a mile to his route. Several guests glanced in his direction before returning to their conversations as though nothing had happened. High above them, inside a spacious executive office overlooking the entrance, Victoria Sterling paused in the middle of reviewing financial reports. As the newly appointed billionaire heiress of Sterling Holdings, every decision she made was watched by investors, executives, and the media. Yet for reasons she could not explain, her attention drifted from billion-dollar contracts to the lone man slowly pushing a battered wheelbarrow away from her family's hotel. There was something unusual about him. He did not appear angry. He did not beg. He simply kept walking with quiet dignity, as though his circumstances had never convinced him to stop believing in himself. Victoria remained at the window long after he disappeared around the corner, unaware that the stranger everyone ignored had just become the first person to interrupt her thoughts in years. Marcus Reed never noticed that someone had started watching him, because people like him learned very early not to expect anyone important to care. After leaving the Sterling Grand Hotel behind, he pushed his wheelbarrow another half-mile through narrow side streets until he reached the neighborhood market where most of his daily work came from. Every familiar face greeted him with a simple wave. The produce vendors knew Marcus would always arrive on time. The flower shop owner trusted him with delicate deliveries. An elderly baker smiled every morning because Marcus quietly carried 50-pound bags of flour into the kitchen before the first customers arrived. He never complained about the wait, never asked for extra money, and never left a job unfinished. By noon, the Georgia sun hung high above the city, warming the sidewalks until heat shimmered above the pavement. Marcus counted the money he had earned that morning. It was enough for a simple sandwich, a bottle of water, and perhaps a few dollars left over. Instead of buying lunch immediately, he walked toward a small neighborhood grocery store, where he noticed an older woman struggling to load several heavy boxes into the trunk of her aging sedan. Without waiting to be asked, Marcus gently set down his wheelbarrow and carried each box for her. When she reached into her purse to pay him, he smiled and politely shook his head. She reminded him of his late grandmother, he explained, and helping her was payment enough. The woman insisted on giving him 2 apples instead. Marcus accepted them with sincere gratitude, believing kindness should always be appreciated, no matter how small the gift. Later that afternoon, he found a quiet public park, where he usually rested beneath a large oak tree. Before eating, he noticed a young boy sitting alone on a nearby bench, staring at an empty backpack. The child admitted he had forgotten his lunch at home. Marcus looked down at the sandwich he had waited all day to enjoy. Without hesitation, he split it into 2 equal halves and handed one to the boy with a warm smile. They ate together in comfortable silence, while birds chirped overhead. Marcus laughed when the boy proudly announced he wanted to become an engineer one day, and encouraged him never to stop believing in that dream. Across town, Victoria Sterling found herself distracted during another executive meeting. Charts filled the conference room screens, investors debated expansion strategies, and senior executives discussed multi-million-dollar opportunities. Yet her thoughts repeatedly returned to the quiet man with the wheelbarrow. On impulse, she asked her personal assistant to find out whether anyone knew his name. The request surprised everyone because Victoria rarely showed personal interest in strangers. As evening settled over Atlanta, Marcus pushed his empty wheelbarrow toward the abandoned warehouse where he usually slept. He carefully folded the old blanket he kept hidden behind loose wooden pallets and watched the city lights glow in the distance. Unknown to him, a sleek black sedan had slowly driven past, twice before disappearing into the night. Sitting behind the tinted window, Victoria silently wondered why a man with so little carried himself with more peace than many people who possessed everything money could buy. The following morning began like every other, with Marcus Reed pushing his weathered wheelbarrow through the awakening streets of Atlanta, while the city rushed past him without a second glance. He spent the first few hours delivering boxes to small businesses before accepting a request to transport potted trees and fresh flowers to a charity fundraiser being held in one of the city's largest public parks. The event had attracted local business leaders, volunteers, and reporters who gathered to celebrate a new community education program sponsored by Sterling Holdings. Marcus did not recognize the company name. To him, it was simply another job that would help pay for dinner. He carefully arranged each heavy planter exactly where the event coordinator requested, making certain that every flower faced the walking paths. Even after finishing, he stayed behind for a few extra minutes to help an elderly volunteer straighten several folding tables that had shifted on the uneven grass. Nobody asked him to do it. He simply believed that leaving a place better than he found, it was always worthwhile. At that very moment, Victoria Sterling stepped out of a black sedan several yards away, surrounded by advisors discussing schedules and media interviews. She smiled politely at everyone around her, yet her attention drifted toward the familiar figure guiding a wheelbarrow between rows of colorful flowers. Before she could say anything, a frightened golden retriever suddenly slipped free from its owner's leash and darted toward a nearby street where morning traffic had begun to build. Gasps echoed through the park as the elderly owner struggled to keep up. Without stopping to think, Marcus quietly set down his wheelbarrow and moved quickly toward the nervous dog, speaking in a calm voice instead of chasing it. The frightened animal slowed, wagged its tail uncertainly, and allowed Marcus to kneel before gently fastening the loose leash back onto its collar. The grateful owner thanked him repeatedly with tears in her eyes. Marcus simply smiled, returned the leash, and walked back toward his wheelbarrow as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Victoria watched every second in complete silence. There had been no cameras near Marcus, no executives to impress, and no reward waiting for him. He had acted purely because someone needed help. That simple truth lingered in her heart far longer than the speeches she was about to deliver. Curious beyond reason, Victoria quietly excused herself from her advisors and crossed the park alone. By the time she reached the row of flowers, Marcus had already lifted another heavy planter onto his wheelbarrow. She thanked him for helping with the event, introducing herself only as Victoria, one of the organizers. Marcus smiled warmly, wiped his hands on an old work cloth, and replied that everyone deserved a little help now and then. He never asked her last name, never recognized the designer suit she wore, and never treated her differently from anyone else. For the first time in many years, Victoria found herself speaking with someone who expected absolutely nothing from her. And as Marcus pushed his wheelbarrow toward the park exit, neither of them realized that this brief conversation had quietly changed the course of both their lives. Over the next several days, Victoria Sterling found herself inventing reasons to leave the executive offices that had once consumed every hour of her schedule. She postponed long meetings, delegated routine decisions to trusted executives, and quietly asked her driver to stop several blocks away from the neighborhood market instead of pulling up in front of it. Dressed in simple jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a light jacket, she blended into the afternoon crowd far better than anyone from her world would have expected. She wanted to experience a few ordinary moments without reporters, security teams, or business partners following her every step. More than anything, she wanted to understand the quiet man whose kindness seemed untouched by hardship. Marcus noticed her almost immediately when she wandered through the market pretending to compare fresh vegetables. He greeted her with the same friendly smile he offered every customer and every stranger. "Victoria," he said, remembering her name without hesitation. "It is good to see you again." She smiled, genuinely surprised that someone she had met only once remembered her so easily. She told him she was exploring the neighborhood after helping organize the charity event, carefully avoiding any mention of Sterling Holdings or her family's fortune. Marcus believed every word because he had never learned to measure people by their appearance. As they walked through the market together, he introduced her to nearly every vendor along the street. The elderly baker insisted she sample warm bread fresh from the oven. The flower seller proudly handed her a single sunflower after Marcus quietly paid for it with a few dollars he had earned that morning. Victoria protested that he should keep his money, but Marcus simply shrugged and said that sometimes a flower could brighten an entire day. His generosity left her speechless because she knew he could barely afford his own meals. Later that afternoon, a sudden summer rain swept across the city, sending shoppers rushing beneath storefront awnings. Marcus quickly covered the few belongings inside his wheelbarrow with an old waterproof tarp before noticing that Victoria had forgotten an umbrella. Without saying a word, he guided the wheelbarrow beside her, so the tarp created enough shelter for both of them as they slowly walked toward a nearby coffee shop. They laughed together when the rain splashed across the sidewalk and soaked the edges of their shoes. Inside the small cafe, Marcus ordered the least expensive coffee on the menu, while Victoria quietly chose the same drink, not wanting him to feel uncomfortable. They talked for nearly an hour about favorite books, childhood dreams, and the places they hoped to visit someday. Marcus admitted he had always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean because he had never traveled farther than a few neighboring states. Victoria listened carefully, realizing that despite everything he lacked, he still dreamed with quiet optimism. When the rain finally stopped, they stepped outside into cool evening air. Marcus thanked her for sharing part of her day with him before pushing his wheelbarrow toward another delivery. Victoria watched him disappear into the crowd with a smile she could not hide. Neither of them noticed a luxury sedan parked across the street, where a sharply dressed man lowered his sunglasses, stared at the unlikely pair with growing suspicion, and quietly instructed his driver to find out everything about the homeless man who had somehow captured the attention of Victoria Sterling. By the end of the week, rumors had already begun traveling through circles where wealth and influence moved much faster than ordinary conversation. The sharply dressed man who had watched Victoria from across the street was Nathan Caldwell, the ambitious son of one of Sterling Holdings' largest investors, and a man who had spent years expecting that he would eventually marry Victoria. Although she had never accepted his quiet assumptions, Nathan believed time and family expectations would eventually work in his favor. Now, every report he received about the homeless laborer only deepened his frustration. One afternoon, he walked into the Sterling executive offices, carrying a confident smile that barely concealed his growing curiosity. During a break between meetings, he casually mentioned seeing Victoria in an unfamiliar part of the city. She answered calmly that she had been visiting community businesses connected to one of the company's outreach programs. Nathan nodded politely, but he could tell she was hiding something. Before leaving, he quietly instructed a private investigator to learn everything possible about Marcus Reed. Meanwhile, Marcus continued living exactly as he always had, completely unaware that powerful people had started discussing his name. His mornings still began before sunrise, and his evenings still ended beneath the abandoned warehouse, where he carefully folded his blanket before resting. One afternoon, a neighborhood bookstore owner asked Marcus to help unload several shelves that had arrived from another state. While carrying heavy boxes inside, Marcus noticed a group of elementary school children searching for books they could not afford. After finishing his work, he quietly used part of his earnings to purchase 2 children's novels and asked the owner to place them anonymously on the reading table. He never waited to see who received them. The simple joy of knowing someone might smile because of a small act of kindness was enough for him. At almost the same moment, Victoria arrived at the market hoping to see him again. When one of the vendors mentioned what Marcus had just done for the children, she stood silently for several seconds. Every story she heard about him sounded almost impossible in a world where so many people measured success by money alone. She finally caught up with Marcus as he pushed his wheelbarrow toward another delivery. They spent the next hour walking through quiet neighborhood streets, talking about favorite childhood memories instead of business or wealth. Marcus admitted that his mother had always taught him that character was the only possession no one could steal. Victoria lowered her eyes, realizing she had spent years surrounded by people who admired everything she owned, while paying little attention to who she truly was. Their conversation ended outside a small community garden where volunteers were planting vegetables for local families. Marcus immediately joined them without being asked. Victoria smiled and worked beside him, getting dirt on her hands for the first time in years. They laughed together, as though they had known each other much longer than a few days. From a nearby parked vehicle, Nathan watched the entire scene unfold with growing disbelief. He had expected to discover someone chasing Victoria because of her fortune. Instead, he found a man who seemed completely unaware of the extraordinary woman standing beside him. Nathan slowly removed his sunglasses, his expression hardening as a single unsettling thought crossed his mind. If Victoria continued spending time with Marcus, she might begin making choices that no one inside the Sterling family would ever accept. The peaceful rhythm that Marcus had quietly built over the years began to unravel without him understanding why. Early the next morning, he arrived at the neighborhood market only to discover that 2 regular customers had unexpectedly canceled their deliveries. By lunchtime, another store owner apologized and explained that he had been instructed to hire a different laborer. Marcus accepted every explanation with his usual calm smile, never blaming anyone, even though his earnings for the day had nearly disappeared. As evening approached, he counted the few dollars remaining in his pocket and realized they would barely cover a simple meal. Still, before buying food, he noticed an elderly veteran sitting alone outside a community center, looking discouraged after dropping a small bag of groceries. Marcus immediately knelt beside him, gathered every item, and carried the groceries all the way to the man's apartment without accepting a single dollar. The grateful veteran offered him homemade soup instead, and Marcus accepted it with sincere appreciation. Across the city, Victoria sensed that something was wrong the moment Marcus failed to appear at the market the following afternoon. The vendors explained that work had suddenly become difficult for him, although nobody understood why. Concerned, she quietly searched several nearby streets until she finally spotted him pushing his nearly empty wheelbarrow toward the abandoned warehouse. His shoulders looked more tired than usual, yet the warm smile remained on his face when he noticed her approaching. Victoria asked whether everything was all right. Marcus hesitated before admitting that some opportunities had unexpectedly disappeared, but he insisted that difficult seasons eventually passed if a person kept working honestly. His quiet optimism touched her heart even more deeply than before. She wanted to help him immediately, yet she feared that offering money would embarrass him. Instead, she invited him to share a simple dinner at a neighborhood diner. Marcus politely accepted, believing she simply wanted company after a long day. They talked for hours, laughing over childhood stories and favorite memories, until the restaurant owner began stacking chairs for closing time. Victoria realized she had not thought about board meetings, stock prices, or family expectations once during the entire evening. Meanwhile, Nathan Caldwell sat inside his office, reviewing another report from the investigator he had hired. Every page confirmed the same frustrating truth. Marcus had no criminal record, no hidden agenda, and no connection to anyone seeking sterling money. The investigator described him as hard-working, respected by local shop owners, and unusually generous despite his poverty. Nathan closed the file with growing irritation because a good man was far more dangerous than a dishonest one. He understood that if Marcus had been chasing wealth, exposing him would have been easy. Instead, Victoria was slowly falling for someone whose greatest strength was genuine character. Nathan quietly made another decision. If Marcus could not be discredited by his past, then circumstances would have to be created that would force Victoria to question everything she believed about him. Unaware that invisible forces had begun moving against him, Marcus walked Victoria to the corner where her ride usually arrived. Before leaving, she thanked him for reminding her that happiness could still exist in the simplest moments. As she stepped into the waiting car, Marcus smiled and wished her a safe trip home, never noticing that another vehicle remained parked farther down the street with its headlights off, silently watching every moment of their farewell. Several days later, the invisible pressure surrounding Marcus finally reached a point where even the people around him began noticing that something unusual was happening. A warehouse manager who had hired Marcus every Tuesday for nearly a year apologized with genuine embarrassment before explaining that someone from a corporate office had suggested using a different delivery service. Another longtime customer quietly admitted that anonymous complaints had questioned Marcus's reliability, even though he had never missed a single job. Marcus thanked each person for their honesty and walked away without bitterness. He believed that anger only made difficult days heavier to carry. Instead of complaining, he searched for new opportunities in neighborhoods where no one knew his name. Victoria, however, sensed that the cheerful confidence she admired was beginning to hide quiet exhaustion. She invited Marcus to meet her at the community garden where they had volunteered together before. As they watered young vegetable plants beneath the warm afternoon sun, she gently asked whether he had ever considered accepting help from someone who cared about him. Marcus smiled softly before answering that accepting kindness and depending on kindness were two different things. He explained that he wanted every blessing in his life to come from honest work because it allowed him to sleep peacefully every night. His answer left Victoria speechless. She had spent years surrounded by powerful people who constantly searched for shortcuts to success. Yet the man standing beside her measured wealth by peace of mind instead of money. As they finished working, a small group of neighborhood children ran into the garden carrying worn basketballs and asking whether Marcus would join their weekly game. He laughed and happily agreed, using 2 old trash bins as makeshift hoops while teaching the children teamwork and encouragement instead of competition. Victoria watched from a nearby bench as every child smiled around him. Nobody cared that his clothes were old or that he pushed a wheelbarrow for a living. To those children, Marcus was simply someone who always showed up with patience, kindness, and hope. For the first time in many years, Victoria felt her heart becoming certain about something she had never expected. Meanwhile, Nathan Caldwell requested a private meeting with Victoria inside Sterling headquarters. Speaking carefully, he warned her that spending time with an unknown homeless laborer could damage her reputation and raise concerns among investors. Victoria calmly replied that character mattered more to her than appearances. Nathan pressed further, asking whether she even knew who Marcus truly was. Victoria answered with complete confidence that she knew enough to recognize genuine goodness when she saw it. Nathan forced a polite smile, but disappointment filled his eyes. Leaving the meeting, he quietly made one final phone call and instructed his assistant to prepare invitations for the upcoming Sterling Foundation Gala, the most prestigious charity event of the year, attended by business leaders, politicians, and the city's wealthiest families. Nathan believed the glamorous evening would expose the impossible distance between Victoria's world and Marcus's. Across town, Marcus finished another long day of searching for work before sitting alone beneath the evening sky outside the abandoned warehouse. He looked at the stars and whispered a simple prayer of gratitude for another day, never imagining that within 48 hours, he would receive an invitation that seemed completely impossible, one that would place him inside the very world that had always looked down on men like him. The invitation arrived the following afternoon, inside a simple white envelope that one of the community garden volunteers handed to Marcus with a puzzled smile. He stared at the elegant gold lettering for several seconds before carefully opening it. Inside was an invitation to the Sterling Foundation Gala, one of the city's most respected charity events. Marcus read the card twice because he was certain a mistake had been made. He quietly asked whether someone else with the same name might have been intended, but the volunteer assured him that the invitation had been delivered personally with clear instructions. Marcus almost decided not to go. He owned no formal suit, had never attended a charity gala, and could not imagine why anyone there would want to meet a homeless laborer. That evening, Victoria called him for the first time. Her voice immediately eased his worries as she explained that the event welcomed community volunteers and people whose lives reflected compassion and service. She still did not reveal that she had personally ensured his name remained on the guest list after discovering it had nearly been removed. Marcus hesitated before accepting. He admitted that he had nothing appropriate to wear. Victoria smiled gently and suggested visiting a non-profit organization that provided donated formal clothing for job interviews and community events. Marcus reluctantly agreed because he wanted to honor the invitation without pretending to be someone he was not. 2 days later, he found a well-cared-for navy blue suit that fit surprisingly well after a few simple alterations completed by a retired tailor who refused to charge him a single dollar. The elderly man quietly told Marcus that good people deserved opportunities, no matter where life had taken them. On the evening of the gala, the grand ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers, while business leaders, philanthropists, and elected officials greeted one another with polished smiles. Nathan Caldwell stood near the entrance, welcoming distinguished guests, completely confident that Marcus would either fail to appear or quickly feel out of place. Then the ballroom doors opened once more. Marcus stepped inside, wearing his modest donated suit with quiet confidence and genuine humility. He carried himself exactly as he always had, thanking every employee who greeted him and complimenting the servers for their hard work before accepting a simple glass of sparkling water. Several staff members recognized him from his delivery jobs and smiled warmly. Their sincere greetings caught the attention of nearby guests, who began wondering who the quietly respectful newcomer might be. Across the room, Victoria saw Marcus enter and felt her heart lift instantly. For a brief moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to disappear. She walked toward him with an unmistakable smile that surprised everyone watching. Nathan noticed the expression on her face and realized with growing concern that this evening was unfolding very differently from what he had planned. Marcus complimented the beautiful decorations and thanked Victoria for encouraging him to attend. He admitted he still felt slightly out of place among so many successful people. Victoria looked directly into his eyes and quietly answered that success was measured by character long before it was measured by wealth. Standing only a few steps away, Nathan listened to every word, already preparing the next move that he believed would finally separate their two very different worlds. As the evening continued, guests gathered around the main stage, where the Sterling Foundation recognized individuals whose quiet acts of service had strengthened the community. Nathan stepped forward with complete confidence, believing the formal atmosphere would remind everyone that status and influence defined success. Instead, the Master of Ceremonies announced a surprise recognition chosen personally by the Foundation's leadership. Curious whispers spread throughout the ballroom as Victoria slowly walked onto the stage and thanked the audience for supporting charities that changed lives every day. Then she paused, looked toward the back of the room, and invited Marcus Reed to join her. The ballroom fell silent. Marcus hesitated, convinced there had been some misunderstanding, but Victoria smiled reassuringly. With quiet humility, he walked to the stage as hundreds of eyes followed him. Victoria spoke with calm sincerity, explaining that true generosity was not measured by the size of a donation, but by the willingness to help others, even when life offered very little in return. She shared how one man had carried groceries for strangers, encouraged children to dream, volunteered without recognition, and given away part of his own meals while expecting nothing in return. Many guests looked at Marcus with new respect as they realized she was describing the quiet laborer standing beside her. Nathan remained frozen, unable to hide his disbelief. Victoria then revealed that she had spent weeks learning about Marcus from ordinary people throughout the city, and that every story sounded exactly the same: honest, humble, dependable, kind. She admitted that meeting him had reminded her why the foundation existed in the first place. The room erupted into warm applause that continued far longer than anyone expected. Marcus lowered his head, deeply moved by words he never imagined hearing. When the applause finally settled, he quietly thanked everyone before explaining that he had never helped people in order to receive recognition. He simply believed that every person deserved dignity, regardless of where they slept or how much money they owned. His simple speech touched the audience more deeply than any prepared presentation that evening. Several business owners approached him afterward with sincere offers of steady employment, impressed not by his circumstances, but by his character. Nathan watched as the opportunity he had hoped would separate Marcus and Victoria instead united them in the eyes of everyone present. Later that night, after the guests began leaving the ballroom, Victoria and Marcus stepped onto the quiet hotel terrace overlooking the lights of Atlanta. She finally told him the truth about who she was, the heiress of Sterling Holdings, and the woman responsible for inviting him to the gala. Marcus stood silently for a long moment, before smiling with the same warmth she had seen since the day they first met. He admitted that her last name changed nothing because he had always admired the person she chose to be, not the wealth she inherited. Tears gathered in Victoria's eyes as she realized that for the first time in her life, someone had accepted her without expecting anything in return. Standing beneath the night sky, surrounded by the city that had once kept their worlds apart, both understood that genuine love was never built on status, fortune, or appearances. It was built one quiet act of kindness at a time, and that was a treasure no amount of money could ever purchase.